What if I told you that the greatest fear of a superpower isn't an army marching on its borders, but an idea rising in the hearts of the people they can't control? What if the real war isn't fought with bombs or bullets, but with strategy, resilience, and the will to stand tall when the world wants you on your knees? This isn't just about politics. This isn't just about Iran. This is about power, real power, the kind they don't show you on television, the kind they don't want you to understand. Because once you know why the U.S. fears Iran more than any other nation, you'll start to see the world different. You'll realize that strength doesn't always look like a flag on a battlefield. It can look like silent survival, and the refusal to break. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear is the hidden truth they never wanted you to know. When you look at the structure of global power, especially in the Middle East, most nations have some thread tied to the hands of Western influence, whether through military dependency, economic aid, or political alliances that favor Western interests. But Iran is different. Iran cut the cord a long time ago, ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Iran chose its own path. It stood up and said no to being a puppet, removed a US-backed regime, expelled American influence, and created a government rooted in its own ideology and values. That act alone sent shockwaves through Washington, because for the first time, a country that had once played by the West's rules decided to break the game entirely, and not just break it, but replace it with a new vision. The fear isn't just about Iran having oil or military power. It's about Iran being uncontrollable. See, most nations that rise economically or militarily still have ties to the West. Their leaders vacation in Europe. Their wealth is tied to Western banks. Their governments may speak about independence, but behind closed doors, they bow to foreign pressure. Iran doesn't. Its leadership doesn't answer to Wall Street. Its decisions are not filtered through Western approval, and that type of freedom is rare. That type of sovereignty is dangerous to those who believe they must manage the world like a chessboard. Iran makes its own moves, it builds its own weapons, it sets its own economy on tracks outside of US-dominated institutions like the IMF or World Bank. It trades with nations under its own terms. And even with the crushing weight of sanctions meant to destroy its economy, Iran still stands. That resilience builds fear, because when a nation survives despite global isolation, it proves that the system is not as invincible as it claims to be. And if one country can do it, what's stopping others from trying? The Western model depends on submission disguised as cooperation. You play by the rules and they reward you. But Iran decided not to play. And that terrifies those who wrote the rule book. This fear grows when you realize Iran isn't just standing alone. It's thriving in certain areas without help. Its scientific advancements, its military growth, its cultural exports, all without needing a green light from Washington or London. That's not just a threat to US interests, that's a threat to the idea that power only flows from the West. Add to that the influence Iran has over its own people, while other governments beg for legitimacy or survive through fear. Iran, right or wrong, has a population that largely sees it as a symbol of resistance. That kind of national pride can't be bought or installed through regime change. And that kind of self-determination is built, and the fact that Iran created it outside of Western control makes it a symbol of sovereignty, a symbol that is dangerous to a world order built on dependence. Iran's independence challenges more than just policy. It challenges the ego of empires. Because if a nation can rise without their help, if a government can survive without their system, then the entire illusion of Western superiority begins to crack. And when that illusion breaks, so does the control. That's why Iran causes fear, not because it's the strongest, but because it refuses to be owned. It refuses to be tamed. And in a world where control is the currency of power, an untamed voice is the most dangerous sound of all. Ideology is more powerful than weapons, more dangerous than armies, and more lasting than political regimes. What terrifies the United States about Iran isn't just its missiles or military alliances, it's the belief system Iran carries, a system that openly rejects Western secularism, materialism, and the cultural dominance that often follows U.S. foreign policy. Iran represents something far more threatening than a nation with power. It represents an idea that challenges the foundation of the Western world order. That idea is rooted in Islamic governance, in resistance in moral and spiritual values that cannot be bought, bribed, or bullied into silence in the eyes of the West. Dominance isn't just about tanks and treaties. It's about controlling the narrative, about exporting a way of life that favors consumption, entertainment, individualism, and the slow erosion of spiritual values. This narrative spreads through media, fashion, movies, and lifestyle branding. It seduces nations into believing that Western modernity is the only path to progress. But Iran stood up and said, no, we will not trade our values for your comforts. We will not let your culture erase our identity. That kind of defiance isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. Iran's ideology is dangerous to empires because it awakens the minds of the oppressed. It tells them they don't have to sell their faith to build a future. It tells them that strength doesn't come from following the West, but from standing tall on your own terms. And that message echoes beyond Iran's borders. It reaches the streets of Lebanon, the villages of Yemen, the minds of youth in Nigeria, Pakistan, and Indonesia plant seeds of resistance. Resistance not to progress, but to dominance dressed up as development. When a nation builds its laws, systems, and policies around something higher than politics, is around divine accountability, around community ethics, around rejecting corporate greed, it becomes unpredictable in the eyes of global powers. You can't negotiate with someone whose values don't revolve around profit. You can't pressure a government that isn't looking to join your club or your banking system or your cultural empire. Iran's leaders don't seek approval from Hollywood or Davos. They speak to a different audience, one that believes this life is temporary and that the real judgment comes from a high authority that's spiritual. Compass makes them harder to sway, harder to manipulate, and harder to break. Ideological fear is deeper than strategic fear. A country with a few missiles is manageable, but a country that refuses to bow ideologically becomes a threat to the system itself. It becomes a symbol, a story, an example. It inspires resistance, not just through weapons, but through words, through sermons, through education. It teaches people to question, to dig deeper, to ask why. Every ally of the West ends up sacrificing their values in exchange for promises that never fully arrive. And that's the kind of awareness that empires cannot afford to spread. Iran's ideology also exposes the moral contradictions of those who oppose it. The U.S. talks about freedom, but supports dictatorships. It preaches human rights, but funds occupations. Iran, despite its flaws, challenges this hypocrisy by standing firmly on its beliefs that truth unsettles the comfortable and empowers the questioning. The fear isn't that Iran will invade or conquer. The fear is that others will follow its example, that other nations will begin to think for themselves, speak for themselves, and walk away from the table where only the powerful eat. That fear is real and it's growing because Iran doesn't just carry missiles, it carries a message. And sometimes a message is the most powerful weapon of all. When it comes to power in the Middle East, most people focus only on the visible military strength, oil reserves, or diplomatic ties. But what often goes unnoticed is the quiet strategic web of alliances that shift the balance of power behind the scenes. And in this game of influence, Iran has played its cards differently. It hasn't relied on foreign occupation. It hasn't set up military bases across the region like the U.S., but has built something more enduring: loyalty. Iran's alliances aren't based purely on economics or politics. They're rooted in shared struggle, shared ideology, and mutual resistance. That kind of connection is far stronger than a treaty signed on paper from Lebanon's Hezbollah to Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. From Syria's government under Assad to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Iran has positioned itself not just as a country, but as the heart of a resistance network. These aren't random groups acting on impulse. They're part of a coordinated front that stands against Western and Israeli influence. Iran's support has given them direction, funding, training, and more importantly, purpose. And that's what scares the U.S. the most, because for the first time in decades, the balance of power in the Middle East is no longer a one-sided affair. There's now a counterweight to American hegemony. And it doesn't operate out of Washington, but Iran. The beauty of Iran's strategy is that it doesn't need to send in massive troops or occupy land. Instead, it empowers the local resistance, strengthens native movements, and supports people who are already fighting for their own causes. This decentralized form of influence makes it hard to break, hard to trace, and even harder to stop. These alliances have stood firm through wars, economic crises, and assassinations. They're bonded not by money, but by a vision of a region free from foreign domination, and that makes them incredibly difficult to dismantle to the U.S. This creates a nightmare scenario because it's not just dealing with Iran, it's dealing with a network, a resistance web that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. And each time the U.S. tries to suppress one part of it, another rises up. The war in Syria didn't crush Iran's influence, it strengthened it. The invasion of Iran had brought it closer to Baghdad. The bombing of Yemen didn't destroy the Houthis, it turned them into a symbol of resistance. Every fire the U.S. tried to put out only spread the flames further. This reach also gives leverage. It can respond to threats without acting directly. It can shift the battlefield without moving a single soldier. This is not just military strategy, it's psychological warfare. It forces the U.S. and its allies to always guess where the next pressure point will be. And that kind of unpredictability drives fear, because when your enemy doesn't play by conventional rules, your conventional power starts to look weak. Iran's alliances have also proven to be deeply resilient. Despite sanctions, assassinations of key commanders like Qasem Soleimani, and intense political pressure, these networks remain strong. That shows that Iran isn't just giving money or arms, it's giving ideology, vision, and leadership. And when you give people something to believe in, they don't scatter. When bombs drop, they regroup, they evolve, they rise stronger. This level of strategic depth is something the U.S. hasn't been able to replicate in the region. Most of its alliances are transactional, temporary, and fragile. When the money stops, the loyalty ends. But Iran has built a resistance culture, one that sees beyond the next election or the next ceasefire, one that believes in long-term change, not just short-term victories. That's what makes Iran a threat, not because it's the most powerful country, but because it has become the most influential movement, and that influence is spreading. One of the most overlooked yet most critical reasons the U.S. fears Iran is its unwavering commitment to independence in a world where most governments are pressured to align themselves with powerful Western nations for survival or economic prosperity. Iran has stood defiant since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Iran has charted its own course, refusing to bow to global financial systems dominated by Western interests, rejecting U.S.-imposed cultural influence, operating outside the sphere of American political dictates. That kind of independence is a dangerous example for other nations that are quietly questioning their dependency on the U.S.-led world order. Iran's independence isn't just political, it's systemic. It's a rejection of being another puppet in a global theater where power is traded behind closed doors. Iran doesn't host U.S. military bases. It doesn't open its economy to foreign corporations that would exploit local labor while exporting all the profit. It doesn't allow Hollywood to redefine its values or the IMF to dictate its budgets. This refusal to be absorbed into the American global machinery makes Iran unpredictable and unyielding. And when a nation refuses to play the game by the rules set in Washington, it becomes a threat, not because it's aggressive, but because it's free. Comes at a cost. And Iran has paid dearly decades of sanctions, global isolation, targeted assassinations of its scientists, cyber attacks on its infrastructure, and constant diplomatic pressure, yet it remains standing still, producing, still innovating, still fighting for sovereignty. That resilience sends a loud message to the rest of the world. You don't have to kneel to survive. You don't have to trade your dignity for dollars. You don't have to copy a Western model to build your own success. And that's exactly what the empire fears. That others will follow Iran's path, realizing that resistance is possible and that independence can be sustained. The American strategy has always relied on making the alternative look impossible. They showcase chaos in nations that resist them, painting a picture that anyone who dares challenge their influence will collapse economically or fall into civil war. But Iran broke that narrative despite every attempt to cripple its economy, to ignite internal unrest, to isolate it diplomatically. The country has not only survived but adapted. It's built new trade routes, formed new alliances, developed its own technology, and cultivated internal self-reliance. That kind of adaptability challenges the myth that the West holds the keys to modernity, progress, or peace. Iran also refuses to be culturally colonized. It guards its language, its dress, its traditions, and its moral values in a time when Western influence has reshaped the identity of many Eastern nations. Iran remains rooted in its own heritage. That cultural independence reinforces its political independence. It ensures that the youth are raised with a sense of self, not a borrowed identity. And that's powerful because once people know who they are, they're much harder to control. The U.S. has long depended on compliant allies, nations willing to accept military protection in exchange for economic submission, nations willing to import Western culture and abandon their own. Iran rejects that entire deal. It refuses to be a client state. It refuses to be a follower. And that forces the U.S. to acknowledge that power doesn't only come from bombs or banks, it also comes from belief, from conviction, from refusing to compromise on the things that matter most. In this way, Iran's independence becomes a mirror reflecting the weaknesses of nations that surrender too much for too little. It exposes the cracks in the global order, reminding the world that there is another way, that truth shakes the foundation of American influence, and that's why they fear it, because Iran's independence isn't just about Iran, it's about what it represents to everyone else watching from the sidelines. One of the most powerful forces in the world isn't a bomb, it isn't a missile, and it isn't an army, it's an idea. An idea rooted in faith, identity, and purpose. Iran's greatest strength doesn't just come from its missiles or its alliances, it comes from its ideology. An ideology that says oppression must be challenged, that injustice should never be normalized, and that submission to foreign dominance is a betrayal of one's values. And dignity, that ideology fuels resistance across borders, cultures, and generations. And that's exactly why the U.S. fears Iran, not because it's just a country, but because it's a symbol of defiance that won't go away, even if you bomb it, sanction it, or isolate it. This ideology was born out of a revolution. It was never about simply replacing one ruler with another. It was about rejecting a system that allowed outsiders to dictate a nation's future. Since 1979, Iran has carried the torch of anti-imperialism, standing up against a structure that rewards obedience and punishes self-determination. That flame has lit up hearts far beyond its border. It inspired movements in Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Yemen, and even in communities within Western nations who began to question the stories they've been told. That's what makes ideology so dangerous to the empire. It spreads without permission. It grows, even under pressure. This ideology isn't about hatred or blind nationalism. It's about dignity. It tells the young man in Gaza that he is not forgotten. It tells the child in Yemen that their suffering isn't ignored. It tells the protester in Bahrain or Iraq that they are part of a much bigger story. That story is one of resistance against a world order that thrives on keeping certain nations poor, certain voices silent, and certain truths buried. Iran has kept that story alive, not just through words, but through actions, by supporting those who resist, occupation, who speak out against injustice, and who refuse to sell their souls for temporary peace. What terrifies the U.S. is that this ideology is not dependent on a government or a leader. You can assassinate a general, you can bomb a building, but you can't kill an idea that lives in the hearts of millions. Qasem Soleimani's funeral brought out millions of mourners, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He became a symbol of a world where people rise against oppression, no matter how strong the enemy may be. That kind of influence is immune to sanctions. You can't sanction belief, you can't isolate conviction, you can't bribe someone who already decided their dignity isn't for sale. This ideology is also deeply spiritual. It's rooted in faith, not the kind that's used to divide or control, but the kind that gives people purpose. It draws from the legacy of Imam Hussein, who stood against tyranny even when it meant death. It teaches that real victory isn't always in winning the battle, but in refusing to bow down. That kind of belief creates warriors who are not just armed with weapons, but with unwavering will, and an army of the willing. Those who fight not for money or medals, but for meaning. That is the most dangerous force to any oppressor, as Western powers, especially the US, rely on a certain kind of silence. They rely on fear, distraction, and division. But ideology breaks that silence. It wakes people up. It connects them. It replaces fear with clarity. That's why even with all their military superiority, they can't seem to crush the resistance that Iran supports, because it's not just about Iran, it's about a spirit, a way of life, a refusal to surrender to injustice. This spirit isn't confined by geography. It crosses borders, it climbs walls, it survives drone strikes and embargo. As long as that spirit lives, there'll always be resistance. There will always be people who choose dignity over comfort, truth over propaganda, and sacrifice over silence. That's what makes ideology the most powerful weapon of all, and that's what truly keeps the empire awake at night. When it comes to warfare, the battlefield has evolved no longer its power only measured by tank soldiers or fighter jets. Today, power is also measured by influence, by the ability to shape narratives, control technology, and defend against attacks that don't come with a bang, but with a blink of code. Iran has become a master of the modern battlefield, adapting to a world where cyber warfare, drone technology, and asymmetric tactics are the real weapons of choice. The U.S. doesn't just fear Iran's traditional military power, it fears Iran's ability to innovate under pressure, to strike back without being predictable, and to turn limited resources into strategic advantages that frustrate even the most advanced enemies. Iran's drone program is the perfect example of this evolution. These aren't billion-dollar machines built in foreign labs. They're homegrown, low cost, and highly effective. From surveillance to combat, these drones have changed the game. They've been used in ways that the U.S. never anticipated, from the Gulf of Oman to the Saudi oil fields. And while Western nations invest in high-end systems that take years to develop and billions to produce, Iran builds its tools in months with ingenuity and grit. That kind of adaptability creates fear, because it means Iran can punch far above its weight and do it without warning. Then there's cyber warfare. Iran has built one of the most formidable cyber armies in the Middle East. These aren't just hackers sitting behind screens for mischief. They're digital warriors trained to disrupt, infiltrate, and expose vulnerabilities in enemy systems. They've hit financial institutions, government agencies, even critical infrastructure, and they've done it without firing a single shot In a world run by technology where a simple line of code can shut down an oil pipeline or cripple an entire city's electrical grid, Iran's cyber capabilities are a silent but devastating weapon. The U.S. knows this. They know that behind every keyboard in Thran could be a new kind of missile, one that can't be intercepted by defense systems. Iran also understands the value of psychological warfare. Its influence campaigns don't need massive armies to spread. They only need platforms through media rhetoric and carefully timed statements. Iran knows how to unsettle its adversaries, how to stir dissent, and how to make every move feel like it carries a deeper message. They operate not just in physical terrain, but in the mind, turning uncertainty into strategy and unpredictability into power. The U.S. strives on control, on predictable threats it can prepare for, but Iran doesn't. Play by the rule book that unpredictability is unsettling. It means that every quiet moment might be a setup for a strategic strike, not with bombs, but with precision influence. What makes Iran especially dangerous in the eyes of its enemies is that it has nothing to lose and everything to protect. It's fighting for survival, for dignity, for its place in the world. That kind of motivation leads to creativity. That country's drowning in wealth and all a comfort can't replicate. It means every scientist, every engineer, every soldier in Iran isn't just doing a job. They're on a mission. And when your mission is survival against a superpower, you don't waste resources. You innovate. You find ways to outmaneuver, outsmart, and outlast. That's what Iran has done. It has turned pressure into progress, sanctions into self-reliance, isolation into innovation. Every time the world tries to corner Iran, it finds a way to escape, not by brute force, but by strategy. And that scares its enemies more than any warship ever could, because it proves that dominance is no longer about who has the biggest military. It's about who can adapt the fastest, who can think differently, who can weaponize intellect as much as firepower. Iran has become a symbol of modern resistance, armed with drones, firewalls, and fearless determination. That's why the U.S. fears Iran more than any other nation, not just for what it has, but for what it's becoming in the shadows of a world that tried to break it. So now you understand it was never just about missiles, oil, or sanctions. The fear isn't rooted in numbers on a chart or weapons in a warehouse. The real fear is the power of resilience. Here's a nation that refuses to kneel, a people who have learned how to turn every sanction into strength, every threat into strategy. Iran stands not only with weapons in hand, but with a purpose in its heart. It's not the biggest, but it might be the boldest. It's not the richest, but it might be the most resourceful. And that combination, that unwavering spirit, that modern warfare intellect, that ideology of resistance is what shakes the world's most powerful nation to its core. They fear what they cannot control. They fear what keeps rising. They fear the truth they can't silence. Thank you for staying with me till the end. I hope this opens your eyes to a side of the story you won't see on the news. Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth. May your path be guided by wisdom, your heart be led by purpose, and your mind stay free. Good luck. And remember, the truth has a power no lie can ever bear.